Hello, history enthusiasts, time travelers, and knowledge seekers. Welcome to another journey back in time here on Backdrop History. Introduction. The Prohibition Era, extending from 1920 to 1933, was a unique chapter in American history when the sale, production, and transportation of alcohol were banned across the United States. This unprecedented social experiment was born from a mix of social, political, and religious fervor and was eventually repealed by the realities of practical economics and social pressure. The Prohibition Era represented an ongoing struggle between changing societal norms and conservative ideals, affecting everything from everyday life to politics and organized crime. Chapter 1: Roots of Prohibition. In order to fully appreciate the genesis and unfolding of the Prohibition Era, we must rewind the historical tape to the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a time when alcohol was a central component of American society, yet also a source of growing apprehension. This chapter explores the roots of prohibition, emanating from a potent mix of social, religious, and health concerns related to the excess consumption of alcohol. To comprehend the driving forces behind this noble experiment, it is paramount to understand the key players that gave birth to the Temperance Movement, the American Temperance Society, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and the Anti-Saloon League. These organizations, amongst others, played a pivotal role in shifting public opinion against alcohol and creating a political environment ripe for prohibition. In the late 18th century, the consumption of alcohol, particularly hard spirits like rum and whiskey, was an accepted and integral part of American daily life. Alcohol was seen not only as a source of pleasure but also as a perceived remedy for numerous ailments. However, by the early 19th century, a growing awareness of the social and health problems associated with excessive drinking began to ripple through society. These problems were especially evident in urban areas, where the population was booming due to the Industrial Revolution and the rise of saloons was stark. Excessive drinking was blamed for various societal ills, including domestic violence, crime, and poverty. In 1826, the American Temperance Society, ATS, was formed by two Connecticut ministers, Lyman Beecher and Thomas Baldwin. The ATS aimed to curb the consumption of distilled spirits and eventually took a stance promoting total abstinence. It used powerful techniques such as emotional, graphic lectures and signed pledges to abstain from spirituous beverages. The society grew quickly and spawned thousands of local chapters across the United States. By the mid-1830s, the ATS boasted over 1 million members, illustrating the widespread appeal of the temperance message. However, the cause of temperance was not just a moral and social crusade, it was also a religious one. Many Protestant denominations, notably Methodists and Baptists, espoused the temperance message, viewing alcohol as a threat to Christian morality. Preachers often equated drinking with sin and advocated for sobriety as a path to righteousness and salvation. The religious undertones of the temperance movement added a layer of moral urgency to the fight against alcohol, further propelling its cause. The role of women in the temperance movement should not be underestimated. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, established in 1874, brought women to the forefront of the fight against alcohol. The WCTU advocated for total abstinence from alcohol and played a critical role in emphasizing the societal and family damage caused by alcohol abuse. The organization also linked the temperance cause with women's suffrage, arguing that women's votes were necessary to enact prohibition. The WCTU's work helped to raise public awareness about the detrimental effects of alcohol, framing it as a destructive force that threatened the sanctity of the American home and family. By the late 19th century, the Anti-Saloon League, ASL, emerged as one of the most powerful forces in the temperance movement. Established in 1893, the ASL was more politically focused and strategic than its predecessors. The League lobbied effectively for local, state, and federal laws to limit or ban the sale of alcohol. Unlike other temperance organizations, the ASL shrewdly sought alliances with any group that shared its objectives, irrespective of their other political beliefs. This pragmatic approach enabled the ASL to broaden its base of support and exercise considerable influence over politicians and legislators. Chapter 2: The Road to the 18th Amendment. The passage of the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution represented a watershed moment in American history. Ratified on January 16, 1919, and put into effect on January 17, 1920, the amendment effectively banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors within, into, or out of the United States. Understanding the political climate, societal pressure, and the impact of World War I provides a vivid backdrop to the chain of events leading to the enactment of this historic legislation. To begin, it is crucial to recognize that the passage of the 18th Amendment did not occur in a political vacuum. Rather, it was the culmination of decades of advocacy by the Temperance Movement, with the Anti-Saloon League, ASL, leading the charge. Capitalizing on growing societal concerns over alcohol's negative impact on public health and moral standards, the ASL launched a vigorous campaign promoting the virtues of sobriety and demonizing saloons as dens of vice and crime. Utilizing persuasive grassroots tactics, the ASL successfully rallied broad sections of the American populace around their cause. Politically, the ASL demonstrated astute acumen, harnessing the power of pressure politics to great effect. They recognized early that achieving their goal required more than merely swaying public opinion; they needed legislative change. Thus, the ASL diligently focused their efforts on influencing lawmakers at local, state, and eventually national levels. They endorsed dry candidates, irrespective of their party affiliations, and exerted significant pressure on politicians through their substantial supporter base. By 1916, over half the U.S. population lived in dry states due to their efforts. Furthermore, the ASL cleverly linked the temperance cause with other prevailing social and political movements of the era, such as women's suffrage and progressivism. By associating the temperance crusade with broader social reform, the ASL elevated their cause from a mere public health concern to a symbol of moral and societal advancement. Simultaneously, World War I played an unexpected yet pivotal role in the road to prohibition. The war heightened anti-German sentiment, a factor the ASL strategically exploited as many major breweries in the U.S. were German-owned. Alcohol, thus, was portrayed as unpatriotic and even treasonous. The war also strained the nation's grain supplies, prompting arguments that grain should be used for food production for troops rather than alcohol manufacturing. The culmination of these sentiments provided the final push for the enactment of Prohibition. However, the passage of the 18th Amendment required not only widespread public support but also a legal and constitutional pathway. Prior to the 18th Amendment, constitutional amendments had typically addressed the government's structure and operations. The prohibition represented a significant departure as it sought to regulate personal behavior and morality, marking a new phase in the interpretation and application of the U.S. Constitution. In Congress, the 18th Amendment met staunch resistance, particularly from urban, immigrant-rich areas where alcohol was integral to social life. However, rural and native-born Americans, who were more likely to support prohibition, were overrepresented in Congress due to apportionment based on total population and not just eligible voters. After much debate and political wrangling, the 18th Amendment was passed by Congress in December 1917 and ratified by the required three-quarters of the states a year later in January 1919. Chapter 3: The Volstead Act and the Enforcement Challenge. While the 18th Amendment provided the constitutional foundation for prohibition, it was the National Prohibition Act, better known as the Volstead Act, that outlined the legal framework for enforcing the noble experiment. Named after Andrew Volstead, a Republican representative from Minnesota and the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, the Volstead Act was passed by Congress in October 1919, overriding President Woodrow Wilson's veto. The law outlined specific regulations for the enforcement of prohibition and proved to be one of the most contentious and challenging pieces of legislation to enforce in American history. The Volstead Act defined intoxicating liquors as any beverage containing more than 0.5% alcohol, effectively outlawing almost all beer and wine production. Notably, the Act provided exceptions for alcohol used in religious ceremonies, industrial applications, and for medicinal purposes with a physician's prescription. As a consequence, consumption of sacramental wine and medicinal whiskey rose dramatically during Prohibition, while industrial alcohols were often repurposed for human consumption, sometimes with deadly results. Enforcement of the Volstead Act rested primarily with the Internal Revenue Service's Bureau of Prohibition, later transferred to the Department of Justice in 1930. This presented a significant challenge. The country was vast, the coastline extensive, the Canadian and Mexican borders long and porous, and the law enforcement resources were woefully insufficient. The Prohibition Bureau never numbered more than 3,000 agents nationwide, with salaries far below that of most professional workers, making them prime targets for bribes. Moreover, local and state law enforcement agencies were often reluctant to enforce prohibition, particularly in larger cities with significant immigrant populations like New York and Chicago, where drinking was a cultural norm. This lack of coordination between federal and local law enforcement further compounded the difficulties of enforcing the Volstead Act. Furthermore, the Volstead Act faced legal challenges almost immediately. Many of these lawsuits questioned whether the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act truly granted the government the authority to regulate personal behavior. Although the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of prohibition in a series of cases known collectively as the Prohibition cases in 1920, these challenges highlighted the broader societal disagreement over prohibition. Simultaneously, the public's opinion of prohibition and its enforcement was mixed. While a large section of the population supported prohibition and saw it as a step towards a healthier and more moral society, others viewed it as an unwelcome intrusion into personal freedoms. This division was apparent not just among ordinary citizens, but within law enforcement and government officials as well. Many people openly defied prohibition, resulting in an increase in illicit activities such as home brewing or moonshining, and the operation of illegal bars known as speakeasies. Chapter 4: Rise of the Speakeasies and Bootlegging. Prohibition, intended to enforce moral sobriety and curtail the societal ills associated with alcohol, inadvertently cultivated an extensive underworld. This subversive milieu, characterized by the rise of clandestine establishments known as speakeasies and the surge of bootlegging operations, effectively gave birth to a new, unprecedented era of organized crime in the United States. With the onset of prohibition, legal saloons shuttered their doors, but demand for alcohol did not dissipate. Instead, it went underground, birthing a vast network of speakeasies. The term speakeasy reportedly comes from patrons being told to speak easy, or keep their voices down, to avoid attracting law enforcement attention. These secret bars, camouflaged behind soda shops, cafes, and even soda machines, thrived in urban areas across the country, particularly in cities like New York, Chicago, and Detroit. Inside a speakeasy, one would find a blend of social classes and races, an unusual sight in an era still steeped in segregation and class distinction. Jazz music, the soundtrack of the Roaring Twenties, filled the air while patrons danced the Charleston and the Lindy Hop. Women, who had only recently won the right to vote, asserted their presence, openly flouting societal norms by smoking, drinking, and donning the risque flapper style. In these hidden alcoves, alcohol flowed freely, creating a paradoxical culture of hedonism under an era designed to foster temperance. But where did the speakeasies source their illicit alcohol? This is where the bootleggers come into play. Bootlegging, the illegal production and distribution of alcoholic beverages, became a lucrative trade during Prohibition. Some of this illegal alcohol was smuggled from overseas or across the border from Canada and Mexico. Still, much was produced domestically in secret distilleries and breweries, while others repurposed industrial alcohol for consumption. However, the scale and organization of bootlegging operations were something the framers of the Volstead Act could not have anticipated. With profits from the illegal alcohol trade reaching astronomical levels, Prohibition inadvertently created a golden opportunity for organized crime syndicates. These criminal groups, well-structured and ruthless, seized control of large-scale bootlegging operations. The profits funded their expansion into various other illegal activities, such as gambling and prostitution, and bought the silence or cooperation of law enforcement officers and politicians. Among the infamous beneficiaries of this illicit boom was Chicago's Al Capone, whose multi-million-dollar operation, characterized by violent tactics and extensive political corruption, came to symbolize the dark underbelly of Prohibition. Capone's reign, though exceptionally notorious, was not an isolated phenomenon. Similar operations sprung up in cities across the nation, as organized crime emerged as a significant and enduring element of American society. Chapter 5: Organized Crime and the Notorious Gangsters. Prohibition, rather than fostering a sober and virtuous society as its proponents had hoped, inadvertently bred an environment of corruption, violence, and organized crime on an unprecedented scale. The ban on alcohol turned a hitherto legal commodity into a contraband product with a high demand, creating a thriving black market. This new illicit economy, with its immense potential for profit, provided fertile ground for the rise of organized crime syndicates. Leading these criminal empires were notorious figures like Al Capone and George "Bugs" Moran, whose actions and lifestyles would forever be associated with the lawless underbelly of the Prohibition era. Perhaps no figure embodies the criminal excess of the Prohibition era more starkly than Alphonse Gabriel Al Capone. A Brooklyn native, Capone moved to Chicago in the early 1920s to work for the crime boss Johnny Torrio. He rose quickly through the ranks of Torrio's outfit, eventually taking over when Torrio retired in 1925. Capone's operation was vast and well organized, involving the production, distribution, and sale of illicit alcohol. He also had interests in various other illegal activities, including gambling and prostitution. Capone's power was not merely confined to the criminal underworld. He effectively controlled local politicians and law enforcement through a combination of bribery and intimidation. His wealth, estimated at over $100 million annually at his peak, enabled him to live a life of flamboyance and opulence, further enhancing his notoriety. However, Capone's reign was not unchallenged. He was involved in a vicious turf war with rival gangs for control over Chicago's illicit trade. One of his primary adversaries was George "Bugs" Moran, leader of the North Side Gang. Their rivalry culminated in the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, where 7 members of Moran's gang were brutally gunned down, allegedly on Capone's orders. Although Moran escaped the slaughter, the incident marked the pinnacle of gangland violence in Chicago and left Capone as the city's uncontested crime kingpin. Yet, for all his criminal bravado, it was tax evasion that ultimately led to Capone's downfall. In 1931, he was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, marking the end of his criminal empire. Despite his arrest, Capone's legacy of organized crime outlived Prohibition and influenced the structure of criminal syndicates well into the late 20th century. Beneath the headlines of glamorous gangsters and bloody turf wars, the influence of organized crime during Prohibition had a more profound, systemic impact on society. The widespread bribery and corruption associated with the illicit alcohol trade eroded public faith in law enforcement and government institutions. Furthermore, the increase in gang-related violence fostered a climate of fear and lawlessness in many cities, directly undermining the moral and social aims of the temperance movement. Chapter 6: Social Impact of Prohibition. While the Prohibition era is often characterized by its impact on crime and law enforcement, its social implications were equally, if not more, profound. It influenced societal norms, public health, and the arts and culture, leaving an indelible mark on the fabric of American society. A central tenet of the temperance movement was the belief that alcohol was the root cause of many societal ills, including domestic abuse, poverty, and moral degradation. By prohibiting alcohol, proponents believed they could create a more harmonious society. However, the reality of prohibition was starkly different. While initial indications suggested a drop in alcohol consumption, these declines were not sustained. The allure of forbidden fruit, combined with the availability of illicit alcohol, ensured that drinking persisted. Moreover, the act of drinking shifted from a public to a private, covert activity. Consequently, alcoholism, instead of being addressed in the public domain, became a hidden problem, further complicating efforts to combat it. Moreover, the family unit, one of the core institutions that the temperance movement sought to protect, was adversely affected. As the home turned into a secret site for alcohol consumption, children were indirectly exposed to the illegal activity. The corruption and violence associated with the illicit alcohol trade also disrupted family structures, particularly in urban areas where organized crime was prevalent. In terms of public health, prohibition had mixed results. On the one hand, there was a decrease in alcohol-related diseases and deaths, such as cirrhosis of the liver. On the other hand, the consumption of poorly made or toxic illegal alcohol led to an increase in alcohol poisoning incidents. Many Americans also substituted alcohol with other harmful substances, leading to an increase in drug addiction. The cultural implications of prohibition were perhaps its most enduring legacy. The 1920s, or the Roaring Twenties as they came to be known, were characterized by a cultural rebellion against traditional norms. The Jazz Age blossomed, with jazz music, associated with speakeasies and flappers, becoming a symbol of the decade. Women, in particular, experienced a newfound social freedom. They flouted traditional norms by cutting their hair short, raising hemlines, smoking, drinking, and participating actively in the burgeoning nightlife activities that were previously considered unseemly. Speakeasies became social levelers, bringing together individuals from various social classes and backgrounds. The mixing of races and cultures within these establishments, particularly through the shared love of jazz music, subtly contributed to the breakdown of racial barriers, although racial equality was far from achieved. Furthermore, prohibition influenced the arts, with literature and films of the time reflecting societal attitudes towards this period. Famous authors like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway wrote about the decadence and hypocrisy of the era. Meanwhile, Hollywood produced a string of gangster films that romanticized the lawlessness of the period. Chapter 7: The Great Depression and the End of Prohibition. Prohibition, a project steeped in the Progressive Era's moral and social reform zeal, found itself increasingly at odds with the economic reality that gripped the United States in the early 1930s. The onset of the Great Depression, the most severe and prolonged economic downturn in the history of the Western industrialized world, dramatically reshaped the socio-economic landscape of the country. This cataclysmic event contributed to a shift in public sentiment towards prohibition, leading to its ultimate demise. The Great Depression, which began with the stock market crash in October 1929, led to widespread unemployment, poverty, and economic despair. As the government sought ways to alleviate the economic crisis, the potential revenue from legalizing and taxing alcohol became increasingly appealing. The illicit alcohol trade had continued unabated during Prohibition, and it was clear that the government was missing out on a significant source of tax revenue at a time when it was desperately needed. Public sentiment towards Prohibition, already waning due to the law's inability to curb alcohol consumption and its inadvertent fostering of organized crime, began to shift even more decisively. People began to argue that repealing Prohibition would stimulate the economy by creating jobs in the alcohol industry and generate much-needed revenue through alcohol taxation. Politically, the tide began to turn against Prohibition as well. The Democratic Party, in its 1932 platform, called for the repeal of the 18th Amendment, arguing that Prohibition had led to a vast increase in crime while failing to eliminate the evils of alcohol. The presidential candidate, Franklin D. Roosevelt, also advocated for the repeal of Prohibition. Upon assuming office in March 1933, one of Roosevelt's first acts was to sign the Cullen-Harrison Act, legalizing the sale of beer and wine with an alcohol content of 3.2% or less. This was a significant first step towards the end of Prohibition. The death knell for Prohibition came with the ratification of the 21st Amendment on December 5, 1933. The amendment, which repealed the 18th Amendment, was the culmination of growing public disillusionment with Prohibition and the economic pressures of the Great Depression. The legal alcohol industry quickly revived, providing jobs and tax revenue that contributed to the country's economic recovery. Chapter 8: The 21st Amendment and the Repeal of Prohibition. The Prohibition Era, characterized by its unique blend of idealism and pragmatism, crime and corruption, public policy and private behavior, met its formal end with the ratification of the 21st Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1933. This amendment remains a unique case in the American constitutional history, as it is the only instance where one constitutional amendment, the 18th, was explicitly repealed by another. By the early 1930s, Prohibition, once hailed as a noble experiment, was increasingly viewed as a misguided venture that had exacerbated the problems it sought to resolve. Not only had it failed to curb alcohol consumption, but it had also fostered a massive illegal economy, with organized crime syndicates profiting immensely from the illicit alcohol trade. The public and political sentiment had begun to align towards its repeal, a process expedited by the economic pressures of the Great Depression. The legal pathway to Prohibition's repeal was initiated with the passage of the 21st Amendment. Congress proposed the amendment on February 20, 1933, and it was ratified by the requisite number of states on December 5, 1933. Notably, the amendment's ratification was facilitated by state ratifying conventions rather than state legislatures, the first time this method had been used since the Constitution's original ratification in 1788. This was done to bypass potential resistance from rural legislators, who were more likely to support Prohibition than their urban counterparts. The 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment in its entirety and returned the power to regulate alcohol to the states. Section 2 of the amendment, which allows states to restrict or ban the importation or transportation of alcohol within their borders, remains a significant factor in American alcohol policy, leading to a patchwork of different laws and regulations across the country. The repeal of Prohibition brought immediate economic benefits. The alcohol industry quickly re-emerged, creating jobs in a time of widespread unemployment. Furthermore, it provided a much-needed source of government revenue through alcohol taxation. Socially, the end of Prohibition marked a significant shift in American societal norms and attitudes towards drinking. While the Temperance Movement had sought to instill a sense of sobriety and virtue by banning alcohol, the practical experience of Prohibition led many to question the effectiveness of legislating personal morality. The repeal signaled a retreat from moral legislation and an acknowledgement of its unintended consequences. Chapter 9: Conclusion, Legacy of the Prohibition Era. The Prohibition Era, a unique chapter in American history, cast a long and influential shadow over the country's subsequent social, cultural, and legal landscapes. Although the noble experiment of prohibition was ultimately deemed a failure, its impacts were far-reaching, forever shaping the United States' relationship with alcohol and providing valuable lessons for future public policies. One of the most enduring legacies of the Prohibition era is the nation's complex and often contentious relationship with alcohol. The 21st Amendment, which ended prohibition, returned the control over alcohol regulation to the states. This decentralization led to a patchwork of varying policies across the country, from dry counties that continue to ban alcohol sales to wet ones with liberal alcohol regulations. Such disparities reflect the enduring tensions between those who perceive alcohol as a cause of social ills and those who view its consumption as an integral part of American culture and personal freedom. In addition to shaping the alcohol policies, the lessons of the Prohibition era have had a profound influence on subsequent drug legislation. The unintended consequences of prohibition, including the rise in organized crime and the failure to curb consumption, provided a cautionary tale for the risks associated with prohibitionist policies. Despite this, elements of the prohibitionist approach are evident in the war on drugs initiated in the 20th century, leading some critics to draw parallels between these policies and the perceived failures of the Prohibition era. Culturally, the Prohibition era contributed significantly to the evolution of American society. The Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age, and the speakeasy culture have become iconic symbols of this period, embodying the spirit of rebellion and transformation. Prohibition also unintentionally fostered a culture of ingenuity and entrepreneurship as people found innovative ways to manufacture and distribute alcohol. In the political realm, the passage and subsequent repeal of the 18th Amendment underscored the power and flexibility of the American constitutional system. It served as a reminder that the Constitution is not a static document but a dynamic one, capable of evolving to address societal changes and correct its course when necessary. Lastly, the Prohibition era highlighted the challenges inherent in legislating morality. The belief that societal ills could be remedied through the prohibition of a single substance proved overly simplistic. It underlined the inherent complexities and contradictions of human behavior and the difficulty of enforcing such legislation. More information and facts. Part 1: Specific Case Studies, Prohibition Experiences Across Region, Race, and Class. The Prohibition era, one of the most transformative periods in American history, was experienced differently across various regions, races, and classes. While the law was uniform across the country, the enforcement and social impacts of prohibition greatly differed based on these divisions. By examining several case studies, we can gain a more nuanced and personalized understanding of this era. First, let's consider the urban-rural divide, an essential factor that shaped the experience of prohibition. In the densely populated cities like New York and Chicago, the enforcement of prohibition laws proved to be exceedingly difficult due to the sheer number of people and establishments. Moreover, the cosmopolitan and immigrant populations in these cities were often more resistant to prohibition. This resistance led to the proliferation of speakeasies, illicit establishments that served alcohol. On the other hand, in rural areas, prohibition often had more community support and stronger enforcement, particularly in regions with influential temperance or religious movements. In the South, moonshining, the illegal production and sale of homemade liquor, became prevalent during prohibition. The traditions of moonshining in the Appalachian region predated prohibition, but the amendment provided these illicit operations a new market. Furthermore, these regions often saw confrontations between law enforcement and moonshiners, contributing to an atmosphere of tension and lawlessness. Experiences of Prohibition also varied significantly across racial lines. For instance, African Americans in urban centers were often blamed disproportionately for alcohol-related crimes, exacerbating racial tensions. Yet, this period also saw the rise of vibrant African American cultural expressions like jazz music, which thrived in the speakeasies of cities like Chicago and New York. The case of American Indian communities during Prohibition is particularly noteworthy. For some tribes, Prohibition was not new. The sale of alcohol to Native Americans had been federally banned until 1953. However, the implementation of Prohibition for the entire country saw an increase in illegal alcohol sales and consumption in certain reservations, often leading to severe social problems. Lastly, social class also played a role in the experience of Prohibition. While the working class often had to risk consuming dangerous homemade concoctions or poor-quality bootlegged alcohol, the wealthy could afford to stockpile large quantities of legal alcohol before Prohibition went into effect or import it from abroad. The personal accounts of individuals like Roy Olmsted, a former Seattle police officer turned most successful bootlegger in the Pacific Northwest, or Carrie Nation, a radical member of the Temperance Movement known for attacking saloons with a hatchet, further underscore the wide range of experiences during Prohibition. Part 2: Influence on Literature and Art, Cultural Flourishing during the Prohibition Era. The Prohibition Era, spanning the 1920s to the early 1930s, overlapped with a remarkable period of cultural flowering in America, impacting literature, visual arts, and performing arts in significant ways. This was a time when societal norms were rapidly shifting, offering artists and writers a rich canvas of experiences and contradictions to explore. The societal changes brought on by Prohibition, clandestine activities, the thrill of rebellion, the increased prominence of women in public life offered themes that lent themselves to creative exploration. In literature, the period saw the rise of a number of influential authors who integrated the societal changes and dilemmas of the era into their work. One of the most emblematic figures of the period was F. Scott Fitzgerald. His iconic novel, The Great Gatsby, vividly depicted the excesses and inequalities of the Roaring Twenties, the underbelly of the American dream, and the contradictions of Prohibition. The book's scenes of extravagant, liquor-fueled parties and the pervasive presence of bootleggers reflect the era's pervasive disregard for the alcohol ban. Ernest Hemingway, another literary luminary of the era, also incorporated elements of Prohibition into his work. His novel, The Sun Also Rises, features American expatriates indulging in alcohol in Europe, where it was still legal, a nod to the hypocrisy and global dichotomies that Prohibition brought about. The era also saw the flourishing of the Harlem Renaissance, a cultural movement among African Americans that produced some of the 20th century's most influential literature and art. Figures like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston crafted profound works exploring racial identity and experience in an era marked by great societal change. The visual arts, too, were deeply influenced by the Prohibition era. Art Deco, with its emphasis on modernity and opulence, became a popular style during this period. Artists such as Tamara de Lempicka and Edward Hopper created works that reflected the new urban landscapes, the sense of isolation, and the glamour and grit of the era. Prohibition's impact was also felt in the performing arts. Jazz music, already gaining momentum, soared in popularity during the 1920s, partially due to its presence in the speakeasies that proliferated during Prohibition. Jazz came to symbolize a spirit of rebellion against traditional norms, fitting for an era where an entire nation largely disregarded a constitutional amendment. The world of cinema was also influenced by Prohibition. The new talkies often depicted bootleggers and gangsters, echoing public fascination with the criminal underbelly of the era. These films would lay the groundwork for the gangster film genre, a staple of American cinema.
Part 3: The Role of Women, Agents of Change in the Prohibition Movement.
Women played a pivotal role in the Prohibition movement, a role that was intrinsically tied to the broader currents of social change that characterized the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This was a period marked by a shift in women's societal roles and the growth of female-led activism, most notably the struggle for women's suffrage. Many women saw the temperance movement as a means to curb domestic violence and improve family life. The Women's Christian Temperance Union (WCTU) was a significant organization that embodied these aspirations. Founded in 1874, the WCTU quickly rose to become one of the largest and most influential women's groups of the 19th century, drawing its membership from middle-class women who were deeply concerned about the impact of alcohol on American society. The WCTU saw alcohol as a destroyer of families and a cause of domestic abuse. Their activism involved not just advocating for the prohibition of alcohol, but also for broader social reforms that included suffrage, labor laws, and public health. The WCTU and other women-led temperance groups were instrumental in promoting the idea of home protection, the notion that women needed to be politically active to safeguard their homes from the destructive effects of alcohol. This idea significantly contributed to changing societal perceptions of women's roles in public life, paving the way for greater acceptance of women's suffrage.
Prominent women temperance advocates like Frances Willard, the second president of the WCTU, effectively linked the Prohibition movement with the suffrage movement.
Willard popularized the slogan, "Do everything," encouraging women to engage in all aspects of societal reform, including lobbying, preaching, and public speaking. This widened the scope of the WCTU's work and significantly increased its political influence. The Prohibition movement also empowered women to participate in direct action. The most notable example is the activist Carrie Nation. Frustrated with the lack of enforcement of existing prohibition laws in Kansas, Nation took matters into her own hands by smashing up saloons with a hatchet. Her actions, while divisive, drew significant attention to the cause and demonstrated the growing militancy of some segments of the temperance movement. However, the role of women in the Prohibition movement was not limited to advocacy. During Prohibition, women also became consumers and sellers of alcohol. Speakeasies, the secret bars that sprung up in response to Prohibition, were often welcoming to women, a departure from pre-Prohibition saloons that were typically male-dominated. This shift in drinking culture contributed to the changing social norms that increasingly allowed women to participate in public life. Part 4: Comparison to Global Prohibition Movements, a broader perspective on alcohol prohibition. The Prohibition era in the United States stands out in the global history of attempts to regulate or ban alcohol. However, it is not an isolated phenomenon. Other countries, driven by similar concerns about public health, social order, and morality, have also experimented with forms of alcohol prohibition. A comparison between the American Prohibition era and similar movements in other countries can provide valuable insights into the cultural, societal, and political dynamics that influence such policies. Let us start with the example of Canada, a country whose timeline of alcohol prohibition was close to that of the United States but varied significantly across its provinces. Canada's temperance movements in the 19th century paralleled those in the U.S., culminating in a patchwork of prohibition laws implemented during World War I. However, most of these laws were repealed by the mid-1920s, largely due to public opposition and the practical difficulties of enforcement. The differing trajectories of prohibition in the US and Canada, despite their cultural and historical similarities, highlight the role of public sentiment and governmental structure in shaping such policies. In contrast, the Scandinavian countries of Norway and Sweden implemented and repealed alcohol prohibition much earlier than the US. Norway instituted a prohibition on spirits from 1916 to 1927, while Sweden implemented a rationing system called Bratsystemet from 1914 to 1955. These countries' early forays into alcohol control can be linked to their unique socio-political contexts, marked by a strong state, a cohesive society, and a long-standing concern about alcohol's social effects. Comparing these examples with the US can shed light on how different policy approaches reflect and interact with distinct national contexts. In the Russian Empire, Tsar Nicholas II introduced prohibition in 1914 as a wartime measure, which continued into the early Soviet period. However, the government lifted the ban in 1925 due to economic pressures and widespread illicit alcohol production. Russia's experience underscores the economic challenges of prohibition and its potential to encourage illegal activities, themes that resonate with the US experience. A global comparison would be incomplete without mentioning the Islamic countries where alcohol is prohibited or heavily restricted due to religious reasons. Countries such as Saudi Arabia and Iran enforce a strict ban on alcohol based on Islamic law, Sharia, presenting a contrast to Western countries where prohibition was largely justified by social and health reasons.
Part 5: Changes in Law Enforcement. The Prohibition's Influence on American Policing. The Prohibition era fundamentally reshaped American law enforcement.
The challenge of enforcing a nationwide ban on the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol led to the creation of new federal agencies, a surge in law enforcement resources, and profound changes in policing tactics. It also fostered an environment conducive to corruption within the law enforcement and judicial system.
The legacy of these changes is still felt today.
The Volstead Act, which provided for the enforcement of the 18th Amendment, led to the creation of the Bureau of Prohibition, a federal agency tasked with suppressing the alcohol trade. Initially a part of the Department of Internal Revenue, and later transferred to the Department of Justice, the Bureau was responsible for enforcing prohibition on a national scale. This marked a significant expansion of federal law enforcement powers, reflecting the considerable challenge posed by enforcing the ban on alcohol. The Bureau of Prohibition brought together a diverse range of officers, including investigators known as prohibition agents, and others whose roles varied from laboratory technicians, who tested for violations of the alcohol content limits, to administrative staff. The most famous prohibition agent was undoubtedly Eliot Ness, who, along with his team known as the Untouchables, became renowned for his efforts to bring down Al Capone. However, while Ness and his team were publicized for their integrity, the reality was that many within the Bureau and local law enforcement agencies were susceptible to bribery and corruption. The Prohibition era witnessed a substantial increase in resources allocated for law enforcement. It is estimated that the number of federal convicts increased 561% between 1915 and 1932, and federal expenditures on penal institutions increased by almost 1,000%. Despite this, the resources were still insufficient given the magnitude of the task, and the rapid expansion often led to inadequately trained officers being brought into the force. The pressure to enforce prohibition also led to changes in policing tactics. Wiretapping, for example, became a common investigative tool for prohibition agents. While the use of wiretapping was controversial and its legality was frequently challenged in court, it was justified at the time as a necessary measure in the battle against organized crime. The Prohibition era also fostered an environment of corruption within law enforcement and the judicial system. Given the lucrative nature of the illicit alcohol trade, many officers and officials were bribed to ignore violations or to protect bootlegging operations. This widespread corruption undermined public trust in law enforcement and the justice system. Part 6: Public Health Implications. The unintended consequences of prohibition on health. The Prohibition era, commonly perceived as a time for curtailing alcohol consumption and thus promoting public health, paradoxically had several adverse health implications. This came about as a direct result of the consumption of toxic substitutes for commercially produced alcohol, which were often homemade and hazardous to health. The public health crisis that ensued during this period offers valuable lessons on the unintended consequences of well-intentioned public policies. With the implementation of the Volstead Act, the production and sale of alcoholic beverages were deemed illegal. However, the demand for alcohol did not diminish significantly. As a result, people turned to a variety of substitutes, ranging from homemade brews like moonshine to industrial alcohols.
These were often poorly made, unregulated, and contained dangerous, if not lethal, substances.
Moonshine or homemade alcohol became a common substitute for regular spirits.
Made clandestinely in makeshift home stills, the quality and safety of these brews were highly variable.
Methanol, a highly toxic form of alcohol, was often present in these mixtures. Methanol poisoning can lead to a range of health issues, from minor ailments such as nausea and dizziness to severe complications like blindness and death.
In addition to homemade brews, many people turned to industrial alcohols, repurposing them as drinkable spirits.
Recognizing this trend, the federal government decided to denature these alcohols, adding toxic chemicals to make them undrinkable in an attempt to dissuade their consumption. However, this strategy backfired disastrously.
Many individuals either didn't realize or chose to ignore the dangers, leading to widespread cases of poisoning.
The exact numbers are hard to pin down, but some estimates suggest that thousands of people died as a result of consuming industrial alcohol during Prohibition. Medical professionals and public health officials quickly recognized the dangers posed by these alcohol substitutes. Some physicians, disagreeing with the principles of Prohibition, even resorted to prescribing medical alcohol to their patients. Despite these warnings and actions, the consumption of dangerous alcohol substitutes persisted throughout Prohibition, leading to a significant public health crisis.
Part 7: Role of Religion, the Faith Factor in the Prohibition Movement.
Religion played a pivotal role in the Prohibition era, influencing both the initiation and the eventual repeal of the 18th Amendment. Various religious groups shaped public opinion and policy regarding the consumption of alcohol, demonstrating the profound impact religion can have on societal norms and legislation. The Temperance Movement, which was the foundation of Prohibition, was deeply tied to religious sentiments. Predominantly Protestant groups led the charge, framing alcohol as a moral issue and a destructive force against the family and society. The American Temperance Society, founded in 1826, was an early advocate for abstinence from alcohol. Many Protestant pastors and congregants were members of the society, emphasizing the harmful effects of alcohol from their pulpits and in their communities. They believed that alcohol led to moral decay, a breakdown of the family unit, and was contrary to the teachings of the Bible. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, and the Anti-Saloon League became the primary advocates for Prohibition. The WCTU, led by women who were deeply religious, argued that alcohol led to domestic violence and child abuse. The Anti-Saloon League, although not exclusively a religious organization, was highly successful in courting support from various Protestant denominations. The League used churches as a platform to rally support for Prohibition, leveraging the moral authority and community influence of these institutions. However, support for Prohibition was not universal among all religious groups. Many Catholics, for instance, had cultural ties to alcohol use through traditions such as wine in the sacrament of Eucharist. They viewed Prohibition as an overreach of government and an infringement on personal liberties. The division between primarily Protestant supporters of Prohibition and primarily Catholic opponents added a layer of religious tension to the broader cultural conflict of the era. As the negative consequences of Prohibition became apparent, the rise in organized crime, the public health crisis due to unsafe alcohol substitutes, and the loss of government revenue, religious sentiment began to shift. Even those who had once been staunch supporters of prohibition began to question whether the societal cost was too high. This shifting religious sentiment played a role in creating the cultural climate that allowed for the passage of the 21st Amendment, repealing prohibition. We've now reached the end of our journey today. Thank you for letting the tales of old be your backdrop, and remember, history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding our present and shaping our future.